Welcome to 221B Baker Street.
Chapter 1. The Peculiar Case of the Living Ghost. The year was 1894, and the thick, sulphurous fog of a London November had settled over Baker Street like a heavy wool blanket. It pressed against the window panes, reducing the gas lamps below to dim, amber smudges in the gloom. Within our sitting room, however, a roaring fire provided a cheerful defiance to the elements, casting dancing shadows across the rows of medical journals and the chaotic stacks of criminal archives that defined our shared quarters. I sat in my armchair, attempting to lose myself in a treatise on tropical fevers, though my attention kept wandering to my companion. Sherlock Holmes had spent the better part of the morning in a state of intense, silent activity. He was currently hunched over his chemical table, a silk dressing gown wrapped around his lean frame. The air was pungent, with the acrid stench of hydrochloric acid and some volatile compound he had been boiling in a test tube for the past 3 hours. "It is a singular thing, Watson," he remarked suddenly, without turning his head. His eyes remained fixed on a precipitate settling at the bottom of the glass. How a man's wardrobe can betray his domestic tribulations long before his tongue has the opportunity to do so. I lowered my medical journal, accustomed to these sudden outbursts of deductive wizardry, yet perpetually mystified by them. "To whom are you referring, Holmes? We have had no visitors today." "No physical visitors, true," Holmes said, finally turning around and wiping his stained hands on a cloth. A thin, enigmatic smile played upon his ascetic features. "But you yourself have been a most eloquent subject. Tell me, how long has your boots' left lace been severed and tied into that clumsy, hurried knot?" I glanced down at my left boot in astonishment. "Why, just this morning. It snapped as I was dressing. But how on earth did you know it was done in a hurry? And what has it to do with domestic tribulations?" Holmes chuckled, throwing himself into the armchair opposite me and curling his long fingers together. "My dear fellow, it is simplicity itself. The knot is a granny knot, whereas your standard fastening is a neat reef knot. You are a man of meticulous habit, Watson. For you to employ such an inferior tie indicates a profound state of distraction. Furthermore, the fraying of the leather upper suggests it was scuffed against the lower iron scraper of a cab, a mishap that only occurs when one is rushing out of the house to avoid an unpleasant conversation. Since Missy Hudson informed me that your morning tea was delayed by a kitchen mishap, and knowing your particularity regarding a punctual breakfast, I deduced that a minor domestic friction sent you fleeing into the foggy streets before your toilet was properly completed." I could not help but laugh. Brilliant, Holmes. Absolutely precise. It was indeed a brief dispute over the state of the crumpets. "It is a trifle," Holmes murmured, his gaze wandering back toward the window. "A mere 5-minute exercise to keep the stagnant mind from rotting. I confess, Watson, London has become dreadfully uninspiring of late. The criminal classes have lost all imagination. A dull thievery here, a clumsy passion murder there. There is nothing that requires the exercise of the higher analytical faculties." As if the universe were answering his complaint, a sudden, frantic clatter of hooves echoed from the street below. A hansom cab had pulled up to our curb. A moment later, the heavy iron knocker of 221 Baker Street sounded with a desperate, rhythmic urgency. "A client," I observed, straightening my posture, "and one in an extraordinary state of agitation," Holmes added, his eyes instantly kindling with that sharp, predatory brightness that always signaled the awakening of his intellect. "Listen to the footfalls on the stairs, Watson, 2 steps at a time, yet heavy. A man of substance, unaccustomed to such exertion." The door was thrown open by Mrs. Hudson, but before she could announce the guest, a tall, powerfully built gentleman burst into the room. He was dressed in the height of Edwardian fashion, a heavy astrakhan trimmed overcoat, a silk top hat in his hand, and a gold-headed cane. Yet his appearance was utterly disheveled. His face was as pale as the fog outside, his eyes wide with a species of terror that seemed to border on madness. He collapsed into the wicker chair Holmes indicated, gasping for breath. "Mr. Holmes," the man cried, his voice trembling, You must help me. I am a man haunted by an impossibility. I fear for my sanity, sir, or worse, for my very life." "Calm yourself, my dear sir," Holmes said soothingly, leaning forward and tapping the man's wrist with his long, sensitive fingers, testing his pulse with an expert medical eye. "Take a breath, compose your thoughts, and when you are able, favor Dr. Watson and myself with the particulars of your grievance. To whom do I have the honor of?" "Speaking." The man swallowed hard, clutching his cane so tightly his knuckles turned white. "My name," he whispered, looking around the room as if the very walls had ears, "is Arthur Sinclair. I am a senior partner at Sinclair and Vance, the shipping merchants of the city." I recognized the name immediately. Sinclair and Vance was one of the most prosperous mercantile firms in London, handling vast trade routes from the colonies. "Ah," Holmes said, his interest visibly piqued. "The shipping magnate. Go on, Mr. Sinclair." The client leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a harsh, terrified murmur. "Mr. Holmes, I have come to you because 3 days ago I attended a funeral. It was a solemn, well-attended affair at Highgate Cemetery. I watched the coffin being lowered into the cold earth. I listened to the rector read the final rites. I wept for the departed. A tragic, yet altogether common human experience," Holmes remarked dryly. "Whose funeral was it?" Arthur Sinclair stared directly into Holmes' eyes, his lips trembling. "It was mine, Mr. Holmes. I attended my own funeral, and tonight, I fear, the man who was buried in my stead intends to ensure that I am murdered for a second time." Chapter 2. The macabre doppelganger. For a long moment, the only sound in our Baker Street sitting room was the crackle of the fire and the muffled rattle of a passing carriage outside. I sat paralyzed, my medical journal slipping entirely from my grasp, to land with a soft thud on the Persian rug. I stared at Arthur Sinclair, waiting for the punchline of some macabre jest. But the raw terror in the man's eyes dispelled any such notion. Holmes, however, merely leaned back in his armchair, his expression one of polite, almost clinical fascination. He steepled his long fingers beneath his chin and gazed at our client through half-closed lids. "You present a fascinating paradox, Mr. Sinclair," Holmes murmured, his voice cutting through the heavy silence. "To attend one's own funeral requires either a profound commitment to theatricality or a remarkably resilient constitution. I presume, given your current state of agitation, it was not the former. Pray, tell us how a prominent city merchant came to be officially interred at Highgate while remaining quite clearly in the realm of the living." Sinclair took a trembling breath, withdrawing a pristine silk handkerchief to dab at the cold sweat on his brow. "It began exactly 1 week ago," he commenced, his voice steadier now that he had unburdened himself of his initial confession. "I had informed my business partner, Mr. Elias Vance, and my wife, Beatrice, that I was traveling to our country estate in Surrey for a secluded weekend of financial auditing. In truth, Mr. Holmes, I was bound for Paris. A matter of extreme delicacy regarding a mislaid shipment of Ceylon tea required my personal and highly discreet intervention." "Ah," Holmes interjected, his eyes gleaming. "The clandestine journey, the fertile soil from which so many tragedies grow, proceed." "I traveled under an assumed name," Sinclair continued. "My affairs in France kept me occupied until Tuesday. Upon my return to England, I purchased a copy of the Times at Victoria Station. You can imagine my horror, gentlemen, when I turned to the obituaries and saw my own name staring back at me. A carriage accident. I ventured, unable to contain my curiosity. "A fire, Dr. Watson," Sinclair replied grimly. "The hunting lodge at my Surrey estate had burned to the ground on Saturday night. The local constabulary found a body within the charred ruins. The remains were unrecognizable, but upon the corpse they found my customized gold pocket watch, inscribed with my initials, and my family signet ring." Holmes leaned forward, his apathy entirely vanished. "Fascinating. A ring and a watch. Items easily transferred. And you, naturally, did not immediately present yourself to the authorities to correct this grotesque error." "I intended to, Mr. Holmes," I took a cab straight to my London townhouse, Sinclair protested. But as I arrived, I saw Inspector Lestrade of Scotland Yard, speaking with my partner, Vance, on the steps. I felt a sudden, inexplicable sense of dread. If a man was murdered in my lodge, wearing my personal effects, it was clear that someone had intended for me to be the victim, or at the very least, for the world to believe I was dead. A sound deduction, Holmes praised lightly. Self-preservation delayed your resurrection. Exactly. I took lodgings in a modest inn near Covent Garden. The next day, draped in a heavy cloak and a false beard, I stood at the periphery of Highgate Cemetery and watched my wife, clad in deep mourning, weep over a casket containing God knows who. "And what has prompted you to break your silence today?" asked Holmes. "Why do you fear you will be murdered a second time?" Sinclair reached into his breast pocket with a trembling hand and withdrew a crumpled piece of heavy, cream-colored vellum. "Because, Mr. Holmes, I returned to my secret lodgings this morning after purchasing a meager breakfast, and found this pinned to my pillow." Holmes took the paper, holding it up to the light of the gas lamp. I peered over his shoulder. The message was constructed from letters cut from newsprint, pasted haphazardly onto the page. It read, "The grave awaits its rightful tenant. You cannot cheat the earth twice." "Pasted with common starch," Holmes muttered, bringing the paper to his nose and sniffing delicately. "The paper is a high-quality bonded weave, distinctly out of place for a Covent Garden inn. And the newsprint." He withdrew a small magnifying glass from his waistcoat pocket, examining the edges of the letters. "Yes, the varying thickness and ink density suggest the letters were harvested from both the Daily Telegraph and a specialized shipping gazette." He handed the note to me and sprang to his feet, his lethargy entirely replaced by a coiled, restless energy. "Watson, the game is afoot. We have a phantom client, a mysterious corpse, and a murderer who feels cheated of his prize." Holmes turned to Sinclair. "Mr. Sinclair, you must return to your lodgings and remain completely out of sight. Trust no one, speak to no one. Watson and I have a train to catch. We must examine the ashes of your first demise before we can prevent your second." Chapter 3. The charred threshold. The journey to Surrey was undertaken in a silence, broken only by the rhythmic clattering of the carriage wheels over the iron rails. Holmes sat slumped in the corner of our compartment, his tweed cap pulled low over his eyes, entirely absorbed in his own labyrinthine thoughts. The oppressive London fog gradually gave way to the bruised, heavy skies of the countryside, and by the time we reached the Sinclair estate, a fine, freezing drizzle had begun to fall. The hunting lodge, situated at the edge of a dense copse of ancient oaks, was a dismal spectacle where a sturdy, timber-framed retreat had once stood. There was now only a blackened, skeletal husk. The smell of wet, charred wood hung heavy in the damp air. We were met at the perimeter by a burly, red-faced local officer, Sergeant Hodges, who looked upon our arrival with a mixture of suspicion and weary resignation. "Scotland Yard sent a telegram saying you might be poking about." "Mr. Might." "Holmes," the sergeant grunted, crossing his thick arms. "Though I cannot fathom why, the matter is closed. A tragic accident. The gentleman fell asleep with a lit cigar, or perhaps a rogue spark leapt from the hearth. The fire took the old wood like tinder. We found Mr. Sinclair's remains near the doorway, along with his watch and ring. Poor soul likely tried to escape, but was overcome by the smoke." "A perfectly tidy narrative, Sergeant," Holmes replied, his tone smooth but laced with an unmistakable edge of condescension. "Nature, however, is rarely so accommodating. If you will permit me, I should like to test the fabric of your theory." Without waiting for permission, Holmes slipped under the police barricade and approached the ruins. Watching my friend at a crime scene was akin to observing a master bloodhound on the scent. His habitual lethargy vanished entirely. He darted around the perimeter of the burnt foundation, his eyes sweeping the ground, his body bent nearly double. I dutifully withdrew my notebook, though I confess I saw nothing but a sodden mess of ash and ruined timber. "The body was found here, you say?" Holmes called out, pointing his walking stick at a scorched depression near the front entrance. "Aye, sir, just inside the threshold," Hodges called back, sheltering himself under a large umbrella. Holmes knelt in the muck, indifferent to the soot staining his trousers. He produced his magnifying glass and examined the heavy iron hinges of the destroyed front door, which still clung to a blackened frame. He spent a full 5 minutes tracing the metal with his fingertips. Next, he crawled toward the hearth, sifting through the grey sludge with a small silver trowel he had produced from his coat. "What is it you hope to find, Holmes?" I asked, stepping carefully over a charred beam. "The fire must have consumed anything of value." "On the contrary, Watson, fire is a remarkably selective destroyer. It consumes the obvious, but often preserves the microscopic," he replied, holding a clump of ash near his nose. He sniffed it, frowned, and tossed it aside. "Sergeant Hodges postulates that the victim tried to flee. Yet, observe the hinges of the door, Watson." "What do they tell you?" I leaned in, squinting at the soot-covered metal. "They are warped by the heat. Look closer at the brass pins." The door was locked, yes, but the pins have been sheared with immense force from the outside, before the heat of the fire ever touched them. Furthermore, observe the stone threshold. "Do you see the deep parallel scratches?" I looked down. Yes, faint gouges in the stone. Caused by the iron heel plates of a heavy pair of boots," Holmes declared, his eyes flashing. "But note the direction of the drag. The boots were not walking out of the lodge, Watson. They were being dragged into it. Our victim did not try to escape the flames. He was brought here, unconscious or dead, dragged across the stone, and deposited inside." Sergeant Hodges let out a scoffing sound. "Now see here, Mr. Holmes. That is pure conjecture." "Is it?" Holmes murmured. He stood up and brushed the ash from his knees, his gaze shifting to a spot just beneath the shattered remains of a side window. He walked over, his eyes fixed on the wet earth. He knelt again, using a pair of tweezers to extract something incredibly small from the mud. He held it up to the bleak grey light. It was a tiny, jagged fragment of dark green glass, its edges warped by intense heat. "A piece of a bottle," I ventured. "Not just any bottle, Watson," Holmes said softly, dropping the fragment into a small glass envelope and placing it securely in his breast pocket. He turned to me, his face set in an expression of grim satisfaction. "I believe I have found the true accelerant of our mystery. Come, Watson, we have seen all that this dismal ruin can show us. It is time we paid a visit to the grieving widow." Chapter 4. The Widow in the Weeping Willows, the Sinclair Estate. A sprawling manor of Victorian Gothic proportions stood some 2 miles from the site of the fire. The drive was lined with ancient, weeping willows, whose drooping branches seemed to echo the sombre mood of the house itself. As our hired carriage came to a halt, the scale of Arthur Sinclair's wealth became apparent. The house was a fortress of stone and mahogany, currently draped in the heavy oppressive gloom of morning. "Remember, Watson," Holmes whispered as we ascended the stone steps, "we are merely solicitors investigating the probate of the estate. Keep your observations to yourself, and allow the widow to talk. Grief is a clumsy mask. It rarely hides the eyes." We were ushered into a morning room that felt more like a mausoleum. The curtains were drawn, allowing only thin slivers of grey light to pierce the interior. Beatrice Sinclair stood by the fireplace, a figure of striking elegance even in her deep black weeds. She was a woman of perhaps 30 years, with dark, luminous eyes and a fragile porcelain beauty that seemed bruised by recent events. She turned as we entered, her expression one of polite, hollow expectation. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," she said, her voice like the rustle of dead leaves. "I am told you represent the insurance underwriters. It seems a cruel irony that my husband's legacy is now a matter for clerks and accountants, before he is even cold in the ground." "My deepest sympathies, Mrs. Sinclair," I said, offering a slight bow. "It is a difficult time for you." Holmes, meanwhile, had begun an aimless, seemingly distracted wandering around the room. He examined the spines of the books on the shelves, stopped to inspect a porcelain figurine on the mantel, and paused by a large, ornate writing desk near the window. "Indeed," Holmes said, his tone perfectly pitched to convey professional sympathy. "But you must understand, when a death is as unexpected and violent as that of your husband, the procedural formalities are quite rigorous. We seek only to clarify the timeline of that tragic Saturday." Mrs. Sinclair sighed, sitting heavily upon a velvet chaise longue. "There is little to tell. Arthur left for the lodge on Friday evening. He was troubled, distracted by a business crisis. He told me he needed the solitude to compose his thoughts and prepare the ledgers for his partner, Mr. Vance." "And did he seem unusually agitated?" Holmes asked, his gaze fixed on a small leather-bound diary sitting atop the writing desk. "He was always agitated of late," she replied, a flash of something hard and bitter crossing her features. "The shipping business is a jealous master. He lived for the numbers, Mr. Holmes. I was merely a decorative addition to his ledgers." "I see," Holmes murmured. He picked up the diary, turning it over in his hands. "May I?" She gave a curt nod. "It is empty. He used it only for notes regarding the Surrey estate." Holmes opened the book, flipping through the pages. I could see the frustration in his shoulders. It was indeed blank. He placed it back, but I noticed, though perhaps she did not, that he nudged it slightly to the left, placing it in a direct line with the faint circular indentation on the blotting paper beneath it. "Tell me, Mrs. Sinclair," Holmes continued, his voice deceptively casual, "were there any visitors to the lodge on that night? Any business associates, perhaps?" "None," she said instantly. "He went to be alone." "A solitary end, then," Holmes mused. He moved toward the window, looking out toward the distant, smoke-stained horizon where the lodge had stood. "And the pocket watch, the one they found in the ashes, was it a gift?" "It was an heirloom," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "His father's. He rarely took it off. It was almost as if it were a part of him." "Remarkable," Holmes said. He turned to face her, his eyes unblinking. "And you say he was wearing it when he departed for Surrey?" "I saw him put it on," she insisted. "Then it is a great mercy," Holmes said, his voice dripping with a faux sentimentality that made my skin crawl, "that the fire was so intense, yet left the watch a memento of such singular value, so miraculously intact for the investigators to find." There was a long, breathless pause. The silence in the room stretched thin, like wire about to snap. I watched Beatrice Sinclair closely. She had not blinked. Her hands, resting in her lap, were perfectly still. "What are you implying, Mr. Holmes?" she asked, her voice cold as ice. "I imply nothing, madam. I only remark on the curiosities of fate," Holmes said, turning toward the door. "We shall need to speak with Mr. Elias Vance, the partner. I trust you can provide his current whereabouts." "He is at our London offices," she replied, her eyes tracking Holmes like a predator tracking prey. "He has been managing the firm's affairs in Arthur's absence." "I should be careful, Mr. Holmes. Mr. Vance does not share your appreciation for curiosities." As we stepped out into the damp garden, Holmes grabbed my arm, his grip bruising. "Did you see her hands, Watson?" he hissed. "She never touched her wedding ring, even though she gestured frequently. And the blotting paper, did you see the indentation?" "I saw nothing, Holmes," I confessed. "There was writing on that blotter, Watson. The name Vance was clearly legible, followed by a time. She is hiding something, and I suspect that the grieving widow and the loyal partner have constructed a cage, far more elaborate than a simple fire." Chapter 5. The ledger of Lies the Ride Back to London was marked by a brooding, restless energy from Holmes. He had spent the first hour in a state of deep reflection, his long fingers drumming a rapid, irregular rhythm against his knees. As the hansom rattled through the thickening twilight of the outskirts of the city, he finally broke his silence. "The widow is a woman of immense self-control, Watson," he remarked, staring out at the passing gaslights. "She possesses the rare ability to compartmentalize her grief, or, more accurately, to exclude it entirely from her performance. And she is terrified, not of the law, but of the very man she claims to be mourning." "You suspect Mrs. Sinclair of complicity?" I asked, shifting to find a comfortable position on the hard bench. "I suspect that the woman who greeted us is a player in a grander drama than she admits," Holmes replied. "Did you note the lack of dust on the mantelpiece for a house currently in deep mourning? The household staff is remarkably diligent, yet her hands were cold. She is a woman who has been sleeping in a room kept at a temperature far too low for a winter night. She fears to close her eyes, Watson. She fears what might be waiting in the shadows of her own home." We arrived at the offices of Sinclair and Vance in the heart of the city just as the clerks were beginning to shutter the windows. The building was an imposing structure of grey stone, exuding the suffocating aura of Victorian commerce. Mr. Elias Vance was waiting for us in his private office, a room panelled in dark mahogany and lined with heavy iron safes. He was a man of indeterminate age, with thin, silvering hair and eyes that possessed the flat, unreadable sheen of polished coins. He did not rise as we entered, but motioned toward 2 chairs with a weary wave of his hand. "I have been expecting you, Mr. Holmes," Vance said, his voice a dry, rasping monotone. "Lestrade warned me that you were meddling in a matter that had already been settled by the local authorities. I am a busy man. The firm is in a state of upheaval following Arthur's passing. What can I possibly provide that the police have not already found?" "I am less concerned with the police report, Mr. Vance, and more interested in the state of the company's ledgers," Holmes said, leaning forward. He didn't wait for an invitation. He began pacing the room, his eyes scanning the shelves of account books. "Shipping is a volatile industry. I understand there was a mislaid shipment of Ceylon tea." Vance stiffened, his jaw tightening. "That was a private matter of Arthur's. It has no bearing on his death." "And yet," Holmes continued, stopping before a large ledger on the desk, "it seems to have occupied a significant portion of his time in his final days. Would you mind if I examined the company's recent correspondence?" "I would mind very much," Vance replied, his tone hardening. "Those are private documents. Unless you have a warrant, you will leave my office immediately." Holmes stopped. He turned to face Vance, and for the first time I saw a flicker of that icy, predatory intensity I knew so well. He didn't look at the man. He looked through him. "You see, Mr. Vance," Holmes said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous register, "I am not interested in your tea. I am interested in why a man who was allegedly burned to death in a locked hunting lodge had his watch, a gold heirloom of immense sentimental value, found in the wreckage, while his business partner seems remarkably eager to keep his financial records under lock and key." Vance's face darkened, a flush of anger creeping up his neck. Arthur was a man of fixed habits. He wore that watch every day. It is hardly surprising that it remained with him. "And yet," Holmes countered, walking to the desk and pointing to a small, dark stain on the mahogany surface, "the watch was found in the ruins, yet here in your office I detect the unmistakable scent of a very specific high-grade kerosene, a mixture commonly used in mining, but rarely in a gentleman's study." Vance stood up, abruptly, his chair clattering backward. "You are overstepping, sir. This is harassment." "Is it?" Holmes stepped closer, his presence suddenly filling the room. "I have just come from the lodge. I found a fragment of green glass. It was part of a specific type of bottle used for chemical reagents, the kind of bottle, I believe, that you keep in the locked cupboard behind your desk, Mr. Vance. You are not just a shipping magnate, you are a man of science, are you not?" Vance went deathly pale. He glanced toward the cabinet, then back at Holmes. The silence grew heavy, charged with the sudden realization that Holmes had not just come to investigate, he had come to trap. "I have no idea what you are talking about," Vance whispered, though his hand trembled as he reached for the desk bell. "Oh, I think you do," Holmes said softly. "The grave may be occupied, but the ghost is still very much in search of his own life, and I believe he is closer than you imagine." Before Vance could ring for his clerk, a sharp, metallic click echoed from the hallway outside, the sound of a door being locked from the inside. Holmes turned, his eyes wide with a sudden sharp clarity. "Watson," he said, his voice urgent, "stay behind me. The game has taken a turn that even I did not fully anticipate." Chapter 6. The Shadow in the Corridor. The click of the lock reverberated through the mahogany-panelled office, a sound that seemed to drain the very air from the room. Elias Vance, who had been on the verge of calling for assistance, suddenly froze, his hand suspended inches from the ivory button on his desk. His eyes, previously narrowed in indignation, shifted toward the heavy oak door with an expression of pure, unadulterated dread. "Who is that?" Vance hissed, his voice lacking its earlier practiced authority. "That," Holmes replied, his voice a low, steady hum of controlled excitement, "is the question of the evening, is it not?" Holmes strode to the door, and, with a sudden, fluid motion, threw it open. The outer office was bathed in the dim, flickering light of a single gas jet that had been turned down to a mere point of blue fire. The long, carpeted corridor leading to the main foyer was empty, save for the dancing, elongated shadows cast by the furniture. I stepped out behind Holmes, my hand instinctively dropping to the heavy service revolver I had taken to carrying in my coat pocket since our return from Afghanistan. "Holmes, look, the window at the far end." A heavy velvet curtain was swaying gently, though no breeze could have possibly penetrated the sealed office block. We moved as one, our footsteps muffled by the thick runner. As we reached the far end of the corridor, Holmes stooped to examine the floor. He brought out his pocket lens, the beam of his small bull's eye lantern cutting a sharp swath through the gloom. "A wet footprint," he whispered, pointing to the dark, smudged residue on the polished floorboards, and a distinct trace of red clay. The same clay found near the foundation of the burnt lodge. "The murderer is still here?" I asked, scanning the dark corners of the foyer. "The murderer, or perhaps the victim," Holmes corrected. He pushed the heavy latch of the window and peered out into the rain-slicked street. The street lamps of the city cast long, golden reflections on the wet cobblestones below. A hansom cab was just pulling away from the curb, its wheels spraying a fine mist of dirty water. Holmes caught a glimpse of a silhouette inside a man in a high-collared ulster, his head bowed, his face obscured by a slouch hat. "Curse it!" Holmes exclaimed, his composure momentarily fracturing. "We have been outmaneuvered." He was listening at the door, Watson. He heard every word. "Who? Holmes? Arthur Sinclair, or the man who is Arthur Sinclair?" he snapped, turning back into the room. He walked back to the desk, his brow furrowed in intense concentration. He picked up the heavy ledger that Vance had been so desperate to protect and tossed it onto the mahogany surface. "We must look at this, and we must do it now. If our mysterious visitor was here to ensure Vance stayed silent, then our time for subtlety has evaporated." We huddled over the ledger under the harsh light of the desk lamp. It was not a conventional record of shipping manifests. Instead, it was a meticulous account of dates, names, and enormous, undocumented sums of money transferred to a bank in Geneva. "Look here, Watson," Holmes said, his finger tracing a column of figures. "These are not tea shipments. These are payments for salvage and insurance adjustments. And look at the date of the last entry." My heart gave a jolt. "The day before the fire." "Exactly," Holmes said, "and the amount £50,000. An extraordinary sum for a man of Sinclair's stated wealth to move in a single transaction. It was not a business deal, Watson. It was a liquidation. Sinclair was preparing to vanish, and Vance was his accomplice. But something went wrong. Something made the puppet master decide to burn the strings." "Why burn the lodge if he was planning to vanish anyway?" I asked. "Because he needed a body," Holmes replied, his eyes reflecting the gaslight like cold steel. "He needed the world to believe he was dead, so he could shed his identity, his debts, and his wife, and emerge elsewhere as a new man. He brought a wretch to the lodge, killed him, planted his own watch and ring, and set the fire to ensure the corpse could never be identified. But he made a mistake, Watson, a fatal error. The green glass, I realized. The green glass, Holmes confirmed. It was part of a phial of cyanide, used to ensure his victim did not struggle, or perhaps used to dispose of any secondary evidence. It was an ingredient that did not burn. And tonight, the man who was burned twice, once in effigy and once in spirit, came here to silence his partner, likely because Vance was beginning to get cold feet about the insurance. Payout. Suddenly, a loud, sharp explosion of glass shattered the silence of the office. A heavy object, a stone wrapped in a piece of paper, crashed through the window, skittering across the floor and coming to rest at Holmes's feet. I dove toward the floor, dragging Holmes with me as the shards rained down like falling diamonds. A message, I presume. I wheezed, my heart hammering against my ribs. Holmes rose, ignoring the blood trickling from a small scratch on his cheek. He picked up the stone and unfolded the paper. His face, usually so difficult to read, went pale. "It is not a threat, Watson," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "It is a plea for help, and it is written in a hand I would recognize anywhere, the hand of the man who, according to all reports, died in the flames 3 days ago." Chapter 7. The Cry from the Grave. The note was brief, scrawled in frantic, jagged characters that betrayed a man operating under the extreme duress of terror. I held the lantern steady as Holmes smoothed the paper onto the desk, his eyes darting across the ink-stained vellum. "They know I am alive. The fire was but the first stage. I am being hunted by the very shadow I created. Meet me at the Blackfriars Arches at midnight. Come alone, or the second death will be my last." "A trap, clearly," I said, my hand instinctively checking the heavy revolver in my pocket. "He lures you into the dark, Holmes. We cannot possibly comply with the condition of going alone." Holmes stood motionless, staring at the message. The usual sharp, analytical light in his eyes had dimmed, replaced by a brooding intensity. He folded the note with methodical precision and placed it in his pocket. "It is a trap, certainly, Watson, but not one set for me. It is a trap set by a man who has finally realized that he is the prey in his own game of deception. You believe this is truly Sinclair? The handwriting matches the samples I observed on his personal stationery in the study," Holmes said. "But more importantly, the psychological profile holds. A man who orchestrates such a complex falsehood to escape his life is inherently narcissistic. He believes he is the only one who can navigate the labyrinth he has built. He would not seek help from the police, nor from his partner, whom he now clearly views as a liability. He turns to the only other man in London whom he believes to be his intellectual equal, myself." "And what of Vance?" I asked, looking toward the office door, where the partner had remained huddled in his chair, visibly shaken by the stone that had shattered his window. "Vance is a broken reed," Holmes dismissed with a wave of his hand. "He knows the secret, but he lacks the stomach for the execution. He will not leave this room tonight. He is waiting for a knock that he fears will be his end." We left the office of Sinclair and Vance and stepped out into the biting cold of the London night. The rain had intensified, turning the streets into slick, black mirrors that reflected the gaslight in long, distorted streaks. We hailed a hansom, but Holmes instructed the driver to drop us 2 streets shy of Blackfriars Bridge. "We must approach on foot, Watson," he cautioned. "The bridge is a place of shadows and secrets. If our client is indeed being hunted, he will not be waiting in the open." As we approached the looming, Gothic arches of the bridge, the sound of the Thames churning against the stone pylons created a rhythmic, mournful thrumming. The fog here was thick, smelling of coal smoke, river silt, and decaying vegetation. It was an atmosphere perfectly suited for a ghost to emerge from the ether. We moved cautiously into the darkness beneath the bridge. Holmes, ever the master of his environment, had extinguished his lantern, allowing our eyes to adjust to the dim, oppressive gloom. He moved with a silent, cat-like grace, his hand resting on his walking stick. "Stay close, Watson," he whispered. "The acoustics of the arches are deceptive. Sound carries, but direction is easily lost." We waited for what felt like hours, though my pocket watch informed me it had been but 20 minutes. The cold began to seep into my bones, and I found myself scanning every shifting shadow, every ripple in the river. Suddenly, a soft scraping sound reached our ears, the sound of boot leather against wet stone, followed by a sharp, ragged cough. "He is here," Holmes breathed. He stepped out into a small pool of moonlight that had managed to pierce the cloud cover. "Mr. Sinclair, you are safe. We are here." A figure emerged from the darkness of the deepest archway. He was wrapped in a long, dark coat that seemed to swallow his form. His hat was pulled low, and his face was obscured by a heavy woolen scarf. But there was no mistaking the tall, rigid posture of the man who had visited us at Baker Street. "You came," the man whispered. His voice was raw, cracked with exhaustion. He stepped forward, and the moonlight caught the glint of his eyes that were wide, frantic, and filled with a desperate pulsing light. "I came," Holmes said, his voice calm and authoritative, "and I brought the truth with me, Mr. Sinclair. Or should I call you by the name of the man you murdered in your lodge?" The figure stopped abruptly. He began to tremble, and then a sound escaped his lips, not a plea, but a hollow, chilling laugh. "Murdered," the man whispered. "You have it all wrong, Mr. Holmes. I didn't murder him. I simply gave him a future he didn't deserve. But you're right about one thing. The hunter is closing in, and you, Mr. Holmes, are the only one who can stop him." Before Holmes could respond, a sharp whistle pierced the air, followed by the metallic clack of a revolver hammer being pulled back. From the darkness behind us, a second figure stepped out, a man whose silhouette was unmistakable, and whose presence turned my blood to ice. Chapter 8. The architect of shadows, the figure who emerged from the gloom of the secondary archway, did not possess the frantic, haunted energy of our client. He moved with a cold, deliberate precision, his long, heavy overcoat billowing slightly in the damp river breeze. As he stepped into the pale, shifting moonlight, I recognized the sharp, aquiline profile immediately. It was Inspector Lestrade, but his face, usually characterized by a sort of weary, bureaucratic pragmatism, was currently a mask of cold, unblinking intent. In his right hand, leveled steadily at Arthur Sinclair's chest, was his service revolver. "Drop the weapon, Sinclair," Lestrade commanded, his voice devoid of its usual, slightly abrasive London lilt. It was the voice of a man who had long ago ceased to be a policeman and had become something else entirely. Sinclair let out a strangled cry and recoiled, pressing his back against the cold, dripping masonry of the bridge. You were supposed to be the hand of the law. You were supposed to be the one who made the mystery disappear." "I am the hand of the law," Lestrade replied, taking a measured step forward, his boots crunching on the wet grit. "But I am also the hand that collects the debts. You thought you could orchestrate a death, claim a fortune, and vanish into the continent, all while dangling a fake trail for the Yard to follow. You underestimated the greed of the men you employed, Sinclair, and you certainly underestimated me." Holmes, meanwhile, remained standing directly between the two men, his hands clasped behind his back, his posture as relaxed as if he were observing a chemical reaction in his laboratory. "A truly spectacular performance, Lestrade," Holmes said, his tone one of genuine, dry appreciation. "The diligent officer who happens to oversee the very case that leads to his own private enrichment. I confess, I had my suspicions when I saw the level of detail provided to the local sergeant in Surrey. It was almost too neat, wasn't it? The watch, the ring, all conveniently placed for the first official on the facial. Seemed to discover." Lestrade did not turn his head, his eyes remaining locked on his prey. "Move aside, Holmes. This is none of your concern. This man is a criminal who has defrauded the insurance firms and committed a cold-blooded murder. I am merely settling the account." "And by settling the account, you mean seizing the £50,000 he liquidated from the firm, I presume?" Holmes stepped slightly to the left, but he did not move away. "You weren't investigating a murder, you were tracking a payoff. You wanted Sinclair to think he was being hunted by a phantom, to keep him in a state of terror, so that when he finally broke, he would lead you directly to the remaining funds." "He's a madman," Sinclair screamed, his voice echoing under the stone arches. "He killed the poor devil in the lodge. He helped me stage it, and then he turned it into his own private extortion scheme." "Enough," Lestrade snapped. He cocked the hammer of his revolver with a metallic click that sounded like a death knell in the quiet night. "Holmes, I have the utmost respect for your intellect, but do not mistake my patience for weakness. Step aside." "I cannot do that, Lestrade," Holmes said, his voice dropping an octave, becoming the cold, authoritative tone he used when he had finally cornered his quarry. Because while you have been busy playing the hunter, you have failed to notice that you are currently standing on a stage of my own construction." Lestrade hesitated, a flicker of genuine confusion crossing his face. "What are you talking about?" "Look up, Lestrade," Holmes whispered. For a split second, the inspector's gaze flickered upward toward the dark, recessed rafters of the bridge. In that moment of distraction, I saw the blur of movement. Holmes, with a speed that defied his lean frame, surged forward, his walking stick lashing out with the precision of a rapier. It struck the barrel of Lestrade's revolver, knocking it upward, just as the weapon discharged with a deafening roar. The bullet struck the brickwork above, showering us with stone dust. Before Lestrade could recover his aim, Holmes drove his shoulder into the man's chest, pinning him against the pylon. I leaped into the fray, tackling the inspector's arm and pinning it to the ground as he struggled. His face twisted in a snarl of rage. "Watson, the cuffs," Holmes ordered, never breaking his hold. I fished the steel shackles from my pocket, snapping them over Lestrade's wrists with a firm click. The inspector went limp, his chest heaving, his face drained of its professional veneer. He looked at us, not with fear, but with a hollow, resigned malice. "You think you've won, Holmes," Lestrade spat, his voice trembling with fury. "But look at your client. Look at the victim you saved." We turned to look at Arthur Sinclair, but the man who had been leaning against the wall a moment ago was gone. In the flickering, hazy light of the distant street lamps, I saw only a dark, empty archway, the swirling fog, and the rhythmic, mocking sound of the river surging against the stone. "He's gone," I murmured, my heart sinking. "He was never really here, Watson," Holmes said, straightening his coat and brushing the dust from his shoulders, his eyes fixed on the empty space where Sinclair had stood. "He was the architect of his own ghost, and tonight he simply chose to fade back into the fog. But do not be concerned. He has left us with everything we need to ensure that the man behind the badge never sees the sun of London again." Went on D. Chapter 9. The anatomy of a deception. The arrest of Inspector Lestrade sent a tremor of shock through the upper echelons of Scotland Yard. But for Holmes and myself, it was merely the closing of a particularly unpleasant chapter. We sat in our Baker Street rooms in the early hours of the following morning, the fire long since reduced to glowing embers. Holmes, his energy spent, had finally abandoned his restless pacing, and now sat with his violin resting against his shoulder. Though he played nothing, the case is solved, yet the most important piece of the puzzle remains elusive, I remarked, nursing a glass of sherry. Sinclair's disappearance. How did he manage to slip away from us under our very noses beneath the bridge? Holmes put down his violin and sighed, a rare sound of genuine weariness. "He did not slip away, Watson. He was never truly under the bridge. He was a projection, a carefully orchestrated illusion." I blinked, my mind reeling. "A projection? You saw him, Holmes. You spoke to him." "I saw what he wanted me to see," Holmes replied, his eyes narrowing as he stared into the dying embers. "Reflect on the conditions, my dear doctor. The fog was thick, the light was minimal, and the acoustics were deliberately manipulated. Sinclair was a master of grand mercantile theatre. He understood exactly how to lead a man's perception, especially when that man myself was primed to find him. But the note, the handwriting, a clever imitation composed by a man who had years to study his own signature and the habits of his partner," Holmes explained. "He knew that if he led me to believe he was in danger, I would be the one to orchestrate the confrontation with Lestrade. He used me, Watson. He used me to neutralize the one man who was truly hunting him, the inspector who had discovered his embezzlement and was planning to blackmail him into ruin. So the ghost was merely a diversion to draw out the blackmailer." "Precisely," Holmes said. "Sinclair orchestrated his own death to escape his creditors, but Lestrade, a man whose financial indiscretions I have documented in my private index, found the thread and began to pull. Sinclair realized that if he remained a dead man, he would be hunted forever by a corrupt policeman. By drawing me into the case, he turned the hunter into the prey. He played on my vanity, my curiosity, and my inherent sense of justice. He forced me to eliminate the threat that he himself could not reach. I sat in stunned silence. The sheer scale of the manipulation was staggering. And where is he now? He has the £50,000. He has his new identity, and he has effectively dismantled his own past. He is on a ship bound for South America, Holmes said confidently. I checked the manifests at the Port of London earlier this evening. A gentleman by the name of Arthur Sterling booked passage on a merchant vessel leaving the docks just as we were heading to Blackfriars. He won't be returning. Watson, he has achieved the impossible. He has murdered his old life and been reborn into a new one, all while leaving the British justice system to clean up the wreckage of his former identity. And the body in the lodge? I asked. The man who actually died. That is the only tragedy in this sordid affair, Holmes said, his voice hardening. The poor soul was an unfortunate vagrant from the East End, likely lured by the promise of a night's lodging and a warm meal. Sinclair's cruelty was as methodical as his intellect. He saw a life that had no value to the world and used it as a stepping stone for his own escape. I looked at my friend, struck by the transformation that always followed a case of this magnitude. The thrill of the chase was gone, replaced by the grim, analytical reality of human nature at its most base. You let him go, Holmes. The law is a blunt instrument, Watson. Sometimes it catches the wrong people, and sometimes it fails to catch the most dangerous ones. I have secured the evidence of Lestrade's corruption evidence that will ensure he spends the rest of his life behind bars. As for Sinclair, he has committed the perfect crime, and in doing so, he has condemned himself to a life of perpetual paranoia. He will spend his remaining years looking over his shoulder, wondering if the shadow he cast will ever catch up to him. Is that not a punishment more fitting than the gallows? I could not help but agree, though the thought of the man escaping scot-free left a bitter taste in my mouth. You did your duty, Holmes, I said quietly. I did, he replied, standing up and walking toward the window. He pushed back the heavy curtains to reveal the first grey light of dawn breaking over the rooftops of London. I solved the puzzle, Watson. The rest is merely the consequence of human existence. But tell me, since the excitement has concluded, have you finished that article on the epidemic in the Midlands? It is far more worthy of your time than this unfortunate episode. He turned back to me, his features once again composed into that mask of cool, impenetrable brilliance, as if the darkness we had faced only hours before had never existed at all. The mystery was closed, the ghost had vanished, and the world as it always did returned to its quiet, orderly rhythm. Chapter 10. The Unfinished Symphony. The aftermath of the Sinclair affair was as swift and clinical as the unraveling of the mystery itself. Within a week, the newspapers were saturated with the sensational details of Inspector Lestrade's fall from grace. His private ledgers, which Holmes had so deftly extracted from the office of Sinclair and Vance, painted a damning portrait of a man who had long operated a shadow tax on the criminals he was sworn to apprehend. The scandal rocked Scotland Yard to its foundation, forcing a thorough, if reluctant, internal reorganization. As for the estate of Arthur Sinclair, it was declared forfeit to the Crown, his widow Beatrice having vanished from London the morning after our meeting. Whether she had joined her husband in his self-imposed exile or had simply fled the wreckage of her marriage, no one could say. I suspect, given the cold precision I observed in her eyes that day in the drawing-room, that she was never quite as ignorant of her husband's schemes as she had led us to believe. It was a Tuesday evening, 2 weeks later, when the fog once again rolled off the Thames to wrap Baker Street in its impenetrable embrace. I was ensconced in my chair, reviewing the final proofs of my chronicle of the case. A narrative I had titled The Case of the Twice-Buried Merchant. Holmes was, for once, not engaged in some volatile chemical experiment or playing his violin. He was reclining on the sofa, his eyes closed, his long, thin fingers tapping a slow, rhythmic beat against his chest. You are pondering Sinclair, I stated, not as a question, but as an observation. Holmes opened one eye, the grey iris piercing and sharp. I am pondering the nature of closure, Watson. We have dispatched Lestrade, we have exposed the fraud, and the authorities are satisfied. Yet, the case feels like a symphony that has been cut short in its final movement. There is a dissonant note that refuses to resolve. And that is, the watch, Watson, he said, rising to pace the room. The heirloom. I had the forensics report from the lab, delivered this morning. The gold pocket watch found in the ruins, the one that served as the primary proof of death, was indeed Sinclair's. But the mechanics were not those of an heirloom. The internal springs were of a modern, mass-produced manufacture, dated no earlier than 18 months ago. It was a replica, a decoy. But why, I asked. If he had his original watch, why plant a fake one? Because he could not bear to lose the original, Holmes said with a trace of admiration. He had a sentimental attachment to the object that outweighed his desire for a perfect deception. He risked the entire edifice of his death by planting a substitute simply because he wanted to keep the original for himself in his new life. It was a flaw of character, a human vanity, that nearly brought the whole thing down. He couldn't help but cheat the world. But he couldn't help but cheat himself either. I shook my head, marveling at the layers of complexity Holmes saw in every human endeavor. You still haven't told me why you didn't press the yard to track the ship to South America. Holmes stopped his pacing and looked toward the fireplace, where the flames reflected in his keen, intelligent eyes. Because, my dear Watson, justice is not always served by the clanking of manacles. Sinclair is currently living in a remote villa on the outskirts of Buenos Aires. He has his original watch, his stolen fortune, and a new name. But he is a man who knows that he was outplayed by a detective in London. Every time he hears a knock at the door or sees a shadow move in the moonlight, he will wonder. If the game is finally ending, he is the prisoner of his own success. That, to me, is a more exquisite form of justice than a cell in Newgate. He reached for his violin, the instrument tucked under his chin, and began to draw the bow across the strings. The melody that emerged was haunting, melancholic, and undeniably beautiful, a musical reflection of the man himself, full of hidden depths and unresolved question. Besides, he added, pausing mid-note, life is far too short for lingering on ghosts. I have just received a telegram from a distressed baronet in Sussex concerning a series of impossible thefts involving a locked iron vault and a collection of missing jade artifacts. It promises to be a far more stimulating puzzle than the business of a shipping merchant. I smiled, settling back into my chair. The fog outside was absolute, but within our walls, the familiar rhythm of our lives had returned. The case of the man who was murdered twice was closed, the ledger balanced, and the game as it ever did was ready to begin again. Sussex, you say? I asked, reaching for my notebook. Sussex, Holmes replied, his eyes once again alight with that familiar, predatory spark. And I believe, Watson, that you shall find the train schedule quite favorable. I looked at my friend, the man who saw the world in the light of reason while the rest of us fumbled in the dark. I knew then that as long as there were mysteries in the world, we would be there to unravel them, one thread at a time. The symphony continued, and I was content to play my part. Chapter 11. The Echo of the Abyss. It is a curious facet of my friendship with Sherlock Holmes that the most profound insights often occur not in the heat of a chase, nor amidst the grim discovery of a crime scene, but in the quiet, reflective hours that follow. The Sussex case had been, as Holmes promised, an intellectually taxing affair, but it was not the mystery of the jade artifacts that sat heavy upon my mind as we returned. To London, it was the enduring shadow of Arthur Sinclair. Weeks had passed, and the dust of the Sinclair investigation had settled into the annals of our private archives. Yet, I found myself frequently returning to those final haunting notes of his violin performance that night. I could not shake the feeling that, in his own way, Holmes was as haunted by Sinclair as the man himself was by his own deception. I found my companion one evening, standing by the window of our sitting room, peering down into the abyss of the fog-drenched street. He was holding a small, velvet-lined box, the very box that had contained the evidence of the watch's forgery. "You are still thinking of him," I said, setting down my tea. Holmes turned, his features softened by the dim amber light of the room. "I am thinking of the nature of the mask, Watson. We all wear them. You wear your uniform of the military physician. Mrs. Hudson wears her mantle of the dutiful housekeeper. And I, Well, my own mask is, perhaps, the most deceptive of all. I wear the mask of the pure intellect, the machine that feels nothing but the cold click of deduction. And yet, I pressed, you showed compassion to Sinclair. You let him walk into the shadows of his own making. Compassion. Holmes gave a short, dry laugh. No, Watson, it was not compassion. It was a recognition of a kinship I despise. Sinclair was a man who dared to challenge the absolute certainty of truth. He turned reality into a stage production. It was a magnificent, terrible performance, and for a fleeting moment I found myself hoping he might actually succeed, not because he deserved it, but because the world is so dreadfully predictable. To see a man truly break the shackles of his own existence, is that not the ultimate goal of the human spirit? I stood and moved to the mantelpiece, looking at the row of tobacco tins and the clutter of scientific apparatus that defined our existence. You say that, Holmes, but you spent every ounce of your energy ensuring his partner was brought to justice. You did not let the corruption go unpunished. The corruption of the law is a cancer, Watson. That I must excise, but the corruption of the individual, that is a matter for the conscience. And Sinclair, I suspect, has a very long and very dark road ahead of his own conscience. He moved away from the window and sat down, the violin tucked under his arm. He began to play, not the complex, soaring concertos of his usual repertoire, but a simple, mournful air, a folk song from the moors of his youth. It was a melody of profound loneliness. Do you ever tire of it, Holmes? I asked suddenly, the words escaping me before I could filter them. The secrets, the lies, the endless procession of men and women who come to us with their broken lives and their dark deeds. Do you ever wish for a world where the fog does not hide such terrible things? Holmes stopped playing. He looked at me, and for a brief, startling moment, the mask slipped. Entirely, I saw in his eyes not the cold, piercing brilliance of the detective, but a deep, aching weariness. It was the look of a man who had seen too much of the underside of the tapestry, the loose threads and the frayed edges of the human condition. To wish for a world without secrets is to wish for a world without humanity, my dear Watson, he said, his voice quiet. We are creatures of the abyss, forever trying to climb toward the light of reason. My work is not the dispelling of the darkness. It is merely the process of illuminating a few inches of the path so that we do not stumble too terribly. The fog will always return. It is the natural state of the world. He began to play again, a rapid, complex sequence of notes that seemed to mimic the frantic pulse of London, itself the hurry, the desperation, the underlying current of ambition and greed that fueled the city's heart. The Sussex jade was a trifle, he said over the music, his voice regaining its customary sharp edge. But it served its purpose. It kept us occupied. It kept the machine running. I realized then that Holmes did not look for mysteries because he enjoyed them. He looked for them because they were the only thing that kept the silence at bay. He was a man who lived in the narrow space between the chaos of the world and the order of his own mind. I picked up my book, but I did not read. I simply listened to the music, watching the shadows dance upon the walls of 221 Ebb. We were two men, one seeking order in the chaos, and the other simply trying to understand the man who did. It was enough. As the clock on the mantel struck midnight, the fog outside continued its silent, inexorable creep against the glass, but inside we remained a sanctuary of logic in a world that was, and would always be, fundamentally, magnificently, and terribly mysterious. Chapter 12. The final ledger, the passage of time in Baker Street, is rarely measured in hours or days. It is measured in the rhythmic accumulation of case files, the shifting patterns of the tobacco ash in the Persian slipper, and the ever-evolving complexities of the human condition. It has been several months since the name of Arthur Sinclair ceased to be a subject of conversation in our quarters. Yet the ripple effects of that singular case remain etched into the fabric of our lives. One brisk, wind-swept morning, I returned from my medical rounds to find Holmes standing by the hearth, tossing a crumpled scrap of paper into the embers. He did not look up as I entered, but the tension in his shoulders, that familiar, coiled spring alertness, told me immediately that something had disturbed his usual equilibrium. "A letter from the Argentine," he said, his voice as dry as autumn leaves. I paused, my hat in my hand. "Sinclair," a brief missive, anonymous and postmarked from Buenos Aires. Holmes replied, watching the paper curl into black lace within the flames. It contained nothing but a single phrase. "The watch continues to keep. Perfect time." I felt a shiver trace its way down my spine. "The man is taunting you, Holmes. He knows you are watching, even from across the Atlantic." Holmes turned, a thin, ironic smile gracing his lips. "Or perhaps he is not taunting me, Watson. Perhaps he is seeking an audience. A man who constructs a masterpiece, even a masterpiece of deceit, cannot bear for it to be viewed by no one at all. He knows I am the only one who truly appreciates the structural integrity of his vanishing act. He needs the architect of the truth to acknowledge the success of his lie." I moved to the side table and poured a measure of brandy, sensing that the ghost of the merchant had finally completed his cycle. "And will you reply?" "I have no need to," Holmes said, his tone dismissive. "The silence is the most eloquent answer I can provide. To engage with him further would be to validate his ego, and I have far more pressing matters at hand. Do you recall the case of the missing diplomat in Constantinople? The Foreign Office has just sent word that the situation has become complicated." He walked to the bookshelf, pulling down a heavy volume of international treaties and trade routes, his demeanor instantly pivoting toward the new puzzle. The transition was seamless, a testament to his unique ability to compartmentalize the past and prioritize the present. I watched him for a long moment, admiring the sheer, relentless discipline of his mind. There was no room in his universe for sentiment, only for the pursuit of the truth, however elusive or inconvenient that truth might be. Yet, I knew better. I knew that beneath that steely exterior, Holmes kept a mental ledger of all the cases we had shared, the tragedies, the triumphs, and the ones that simply faded away into the fog. Sinclair was a line item in that ledger, a cautionary tale of how easily a man could be consumed by his own shadow. "You know, Holmes," I ventured, "it is quite remarkable how we always seem to return to the beginning. We start with a mystery, we unravel the threads, and we end up exactly where we were, only with a little more clarity about the darkness that surrounds us. That is the fundamental nature of the detective, Watson," Holmes remarked, not looking up from his text. "We are the gardeners of the human conscience. We prune the weeds, we clear the rot, and we hope that the garden remains habitable for another season. But we do not grow the flowers, nor do we stop the rain. We merely ensure that the path remains navigable." He snapped the book shut and looked at me, his eyes dancing with that familiar, restless fire. The Sinclair affair had been a dark, complex, and deeply unsettling chapter, but it was now closed. The ledger was balanced. The man who had been murdered twice had found his peace or his prison in the distant south, and we were left with the cold, clear light of another mystery dawning upon the horizon. "Come, Watson," he said, grabbing his coat and his "Dear stalker, the world is full of people who believe they have escaped the consequences of their actions. It is a persistent, if misguided, delusion. Let us see what the morning mail has brought us in the way of enlightenment." As we descended the stairs of 221 the familiar sounds of London, life rose up to meet us, the shouts of the street hawkers, the rattle of iron-rimmed wheels on stone, and the distant, constant hum of a city that never fully slept. The fog was lifting, revealing the sharp, slate-grey skyline of the capital. I stepped out into the street, feeling the chill air against my face, and found myself smiling. The case of Arthur Sinclair was gone, relegated to the dusty shelves of memory, but the adventure was eternal. Beside me, the world's greatest detective began to whistle a soft, tuneless air, already mapping out the variables of a new problem. For Sherlock Holmes, and for me, the game was, as it had always been, the only thing that truly mattered. And, as the hansom pulled to the curb, I stepped inside, ready to follow him into the next chapter of our lives, wherever the logic of the world might lead us.